Hello, dear friends. Tonight I invite you to step back, far back, into a world where myth and memory share the same breath. A time when gods walked among mortals, when rivers whispered their secrets, and when music was more than entertainment. It was a power that could soothe beasts, bend trees, and change the very heart of fate. This is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, one of the most enduring love stories ever told. In the land of Thrace, rugged and wild, where mountains rise like sleeping titans and rivers coil silver ribbons through valleys, a child was born whose name would echo across eternity. His mother was Calliope, eldest of the Muses, guardian of epic poetry and memory. She was not merely a singer of tales, but the voice that kept heroes alive in story long after their bones had turned to dust. Some whispered that his father was Oeagrus, the mortal king of Thrace, a man of proud lineage. Others whispered something bolder, that Apollo, god of light and music himself, had touched Calliope's life, and that this child carried within him the pulse of divinity. From the moment of his birth, strange signs followed him. When he cried, it was not a shrill cry, but a sound so pure that a shepherd resting nearby paused and pressed his hand to his chest, struck by sudden peace. Birds tilted their heads and listened. The rafters of the house hummed faintly, as if remembering the trees they once had been. The world seemed to recognize the boy before he even recognized himself. He was given the name Orpheus. As he grew, it became clear he was no ordinary child. While other boys chased each other through fields or tested their strength against stones, Orpheus sat quietly, listening. He listened to the rustle of leaves, to the murmur of streams, to the rhythm of footsteps in dust. He listened so deeply that even silence became a kind of music to him. Calliope, who understood more than she ever said, placed a small lyre in his hands when he was old enough to hold it. The lyre was simple, its body carved from polished wood, its strings taut and shining. But to Orpheus, it was a universe. The first time he plucked its strings, the sound shimmered through the air like sunlight rippling on water. He laughed, a bright, startled laugh, and played again. From then on, the lyre was never far from him. He carried it into the fields, where sheep lifted their heads to listen. He carried it to the riverbank, where fish broke the surface as though curious. He played in the marketplace, where busy hands paused and angry voices softened. He played at dusk, and even the stars seemed to prick the sky in rhythm to his chords. Soon, all Thrace spoke of him. "The boy who plays and the world listens," they said. Old men, hardened by years of labor, found their eyes wet when his notes floated through the air. Mothers pressed their children to their breasts more gently. Even wild creatures felt the spell. Deer emerged from forests to stand near him. Wolves who would have torn lambs apart lay down at his feet like guardians. It was said that once, when a storm swept over the hills, Orpheus stood at his doorway and played, and the thunder softened as if ashamed to roar against such beauty. But it was not only power that grew in him. Orpheus also grew wise. He learned that music was not trickery. It did not force the world to change. It reminded the world of what it already longed to be. When he played for beasts, he awakened gentleness that lived, hidden, in their hearts. When he played for men, he reminded them of the courage or kindness they had forgotten. Music to him was truth spoken aloud. As he entered youth, Apollo himself came to him in dreams. not blazing in golden majesty, but quietly, as a teacher arrives in the silence of morning. Apollo showed him how each string could mirror the motions of the heavens. Low chords like the turning of the earth, high notes like the dance of stars. He taught him that harmony was not only between notes, but between all things: sun and soil, seed and rain, life and death. Orpheus awoke from such dreams with his hands burning to play, and when he did, it seemed the air itself grew lighter. Word of Orpheus spread far beyond Thrace. Sailors spoke of him in distant harbors. Travelers carried his name like a blessing. Eventually, the call of adventure reached him. Jason, leader of the Argonauts, sought him out. For he knew that courage alone would not be enough for the voyage ahead. They needed a voice strong enough to hold men together when fear clawed at their hearts. And so Orpheus joined the greatest heroes of his age aboard the ship Argo. The sea was restless, its waves rearing high, its winds sharp as knives. Men bent their backs to the oars, sweat running, hearts faltering. But then Orpheus lifted his lyre. His song spread across the deck, steady as a heartbeat, gentle as a hand on the shoulder. The oars found rhythm. Fear found its place and shrank. The ship cut forward, each stroke of the oar like a note in a great symphony. When the sirens rose, their voices rich with deadly promise, calling men to throw themselves into the sea, Orpheus did not panic. He stepped forward and played, his song a counterpoint of truth against their deceit. The sirens offered lies, sweet as honey. Orpheus offered the steady warmth of bread, the familiar comfort of hearth, the ache and beauty of endurance. The sailors covered their ears not against him, but against the sirens. His music carried them past the danger, safe. Later, the Argonauts would say he had saved them. Orpheus only shook his head. Music saves no one, he told them quietly. It only reminds you how to save yourselves. When at last the voyage ended, Orpheus returned to Thrace, not crowned with glory, but carrying something greater, the deepened truth of his gift. He had seen the power of his music, had watched it calm seas and silence death's daughters. Yet he sought no throne, no riches. He wandered again into fields and forests, playing for the earth, for the sky, for whoever wished to listen. It was in those meadows, under sunlight woven with shadow, that fate guided him toward the one soul who would change his life forever, Eurydice. He did not meet her as heroes often meet their loves, amid trumpets and crowds, but in the kind of hour that has its own privacy. Late afternoon, when sunlight thins to amber, and the world hushes to listen for what evening will say. Orpheus had walked beyond the olives, where the meadow opened like a book someone patient had been copying for years. He carried his lyre across his back, the strap dark with use. Bees wobbled from flower to flower with the purposeful clumsiness of tiny kings. A thread of water turned over white stones and forgot to be loud. Eurydice stepped into that hour as if it belonged to her. She moved barefoot through the grasses, a woven basket looped over one arm, her other hand testing stems the way a scribe tests ink. Her dress was linen, plain and pale, the hem already green where she'd walked through time. Her hair wasn't the gold of palaces, but the color wheat learns at dusk. Serious, warm, remembering the day without boasting. She had the look of people who have lived close to weather. They treat the world with respect because the world has a memory. He saw her before she saw him, and because he understood both music and silence, he did not call out. He watched how the wind talked to her hair and how she listened, not with the ears only, but with her attention, that rarest courtesy. He loosened the lyre from his shoulder, rested it along his knee, and tried a single note, small as a droplet. It landed softly. The meadow didn't flinch. She lifted her head. Their eyes met in a way that made each feel less lonely in their own bodies. A smile, no costume to it, showed and was gone, like a bird that trusts the branch but will not stay to be stared at. "Play again," she said, and her voice was low enough that the air didn't need to carry it far. He did. Not a showpiece or a flourish, just 4 measures that felt like the inside of a hand. Open, honest, warm. She came closer, set the basket down, and knelt to smell the fennel. "For fevers," she said, without looking up. "For nerves that tie themselves in knots." Only then did she turn. "And for players who forget to eat." "Then I'm in your care," he answered. They walked as people do when a path is new but already makes sense. She named herbs the way some name constellations: hyssop for breath, yarrow for blood, mint for stubborn throats. He named birds by their songs and could tell the difference between 2 grasses by the way they argued with the wind. They traded small truths. She had once pulled a lamb from a ditch and been bitten for her trouble and hadn't minded. He had once calmed a child's terror with a single chord and later couldn't remember what chord it had been. Both thought this was important. If love begins with resemblance, theirs began with attention. Each recognized in the other the habit of careful seeing. When he played, he watched her listen. When she spoke, she watched him hear. Days arranged themselves around their meetings with the quiet competence of good servants. In the mornings, they worked separately. She in the garden, he repairing a crack in the soundboard or practicing the same passage, until thought dissolved, and the fingers knew what the heart had been trying to say. In the afternoons, they found each other where the path dropped to the river. Dragonflies made blue commas in the air. He played and let silence answer. She wove a small garland and let it come apart on purpose, to learn how things hold and how they let go. He learned the history of her hands. The left bore a thin white scar shaped like a crescent, sickle's kiss from harvest. The right had a thickened pad where she gripped the knife to strip stems. She learned the history of his shoulders, the small knots that formed after long hours of playing, the way he stretched before performance, not to impress, but to ask for partnership from his own body. He taught her the discipline of strings. One note survives because the next one will arrive to meet it. She taught him the discipline of infusion. Time does the work. Your job is not to hurry it. Summer thickened. The olive press rumbled at dusk. Children ran with dust on their shins like medals. They walked home together by a route that added a bend for no reason but the pleasure of the bend. A dog decided they were his responsibility and escort. The baker learned their names and kept aside a loaf that cracked like fire when opened. The woman who sold olives insisted on sending the bitter ones as well as the sweet. "For courage," she said, and would not be argued with. There were quarrels because love that has never quarreled is untested cloth. He, certain that a melody must fall a particular way, pressed too much. She, certain that a remedy must steep a particular length, defended too hard. They learned the ritual of apology. he would play a phrase unfinished and wait. She would complete it, wrong on purpose, and they would laugh. Or she would leave a cup of mint on the threshold, and he would drink it cold, and the heat between them would learn humility. Every quarrel ended by adding a small tool to their shared kit. A word, a touch, an inside joke. This is how a house is built when the timber is patience. Autumn drew lines across the hills in ochre and rust. He took her to the cliff above the sea and showed her how the horizon is a lesson in limits and in comfort. You cannot go there now, and that is also all right. She showed him how to read the growth of moss on a northern stone and find his way home after dark. He played in the press yard while men turned the screw, and the thick green stream ran out with a smell that made the night feel kind. She bound scratches with honey and cloth, told stories that ended with practical wisdom, not moral, and made the tired laugh without resenting it. When winter came, the cold had a flavor. Metal, clean, unshone. They kept a small fire, talked less, listened more. Orpheus tuned the lyre down a half step so the wood would not crack. Eurydice hung sprigs of rosemary over the lintel to teach the air its responsibilities. They slept like two commas in the same sentence. Outside, the old men said the cold was like the good laws, strict, impartial, survivable. Inside, they learned who woke first to feed the fire, her. Who remembered to check the banked coals at night, him. The dog found the warmest place and kept it. He played to keep fingers honest. She stitched to keep thoughts from outrunning themselves. They began to speak of spring not as a season, but as a plan. When the world softened again, the village softened with it. A marriage proposal in Thrace is not a spectacle. It's a promise said aloud in front of witnesses you will have to face tomorrow. Orpheus brought bread, his worst skill, and olives, his second worst skill, and music, his best. Eurydice brought a ribbon kept since girlhood, faded to a shade that had never been named. They stood beneath the oldest plane tree and let old women approve their posture. He asked not with speeches, but by speaking her name once, as though it contained a question and an answer. She answered with the yes that has no vanity. The wedding was the length of an afternoon that forgot to be impatient. The village contributed the things villages have always contributed. Bread with crusts that sang when torn. Oil that trapped sunlight and set it free a little at a time. Wine that made tongues confident without making them cruel. Boys tested each other with small risks and were forgiven. Men argued about weather and money and ended in agreement because the day required it. Girls learned by watching how women carry joy. With hands busy, with eyes alert, with feet that try not to step on the fragile parts of other people's stories. Hymenaios came, as the tales say he always does, a slight god with a torch meant to declare auspice. The flame smoked. A strip of gray rose where gold should have insisted. Some noticed and said nothing. Knowledge is not always a blessing to carry through a feast. Orpheus saw and felt the stitch in his chest that doubt can make. He turned and found Eurydice laughing at something a child had said about bees. He tuned a string a breath higher and asked the day to be decided by what was present, not by what might be written. He played, and the world rearranged itself around listening. He did not play to dazzle. He played the inside of bread. He played the line of a roof beam. He played the patience of a chair that holds the tired without complaint. Nymphs kept to the edges and signed their names to the air with the lightest of hands. Satyrs tried mischief and were tamed by the gaze of grandmothers who had lifted heavier things than mischief and would not be impressed. The dance began not with a shout, but with a shared breath. Feet remembered what they had forgotten. The dust rose and made halos. There was a moment just after sunset when sound and light and warmth made a single chord, and it felt like standing inside the answer to a question you had been asking since childhood without words. That moment passed, as all mercies do, when the dark remembered its portion. They carried their crowns, twined grass, a strip of ribbon, a fig leaf for luck, back to the whitewashed room that would be their weather. They set them on the table as if laying tools down between tasks. He placed the lyre beside them. They sat. They did nothing. The night came beside them and behaved. In the morning, they entered the new ordinary. He oversalted the porridge and apologized with a melody. She forgot to water the rosemary and apologized with a story so funny the plant forgave her. They settled which window should stay open in summer, north, which should be shuttered hard in winter, west, where the fig sapling would go, south wall, so the fruit would learn sweetness in long light. They fixed a nail to hold their crowns. They learned the protocols of shared space. Who takes the second bite when the first is hot? Whose hand reaches for the pot before the handle? How to argue about small things in a way that practices for the large. They built a calendar of kindness. On seventh days they walked to the river, whether it needed them or not, to greet its water like a neighbor whose stories, while repetitive, are comforting. On market days, he carried the heavier load and pretended not to notice. On the days she gathered herbs beyond the visible edge of the village, he went as far as the old cedar and pretended to turn back reluctantly, but waited until he saw her return. In storms they counted between lightning and thunder and invented meanings for the numbers. In heat they slept in the courtyard and woke to stars, making a good argument for eternity. People talk when they are jealous of peace. There were rumors about her, too quiet, too country. About him, too gentle, too blessed. Rumors are the taxes joy pays. They paid by keeping their door open, but their table small. They practiced the craft of hosting without exhaustion. Enough bread, enough water, enough time. Not the kind of plenty that makes guests forget what home is. They learned to be grateful to leave parties early and honest when staying late would have been a lie. They survived a winter illness with broth and stubbornness. They delivered a neighbor's child together, she with hands, he with voice, and never told the story as if they were heroes. In the second spring, when the press work was done and the river could be crossed without wetting the knee, they took a day to do nothing but practice happiness. Practice, because happiness is a skill. They moved without agenda through places that had once been separate and were now theirs by repetition. A stone where he had played the first time she closed her eyes without defensiveness. A willow that had taught her the value of bending. A patch of wild thyme whose scent had convinced them to plant the fig 1 arm's length further east. They spoke of the future the way bakers speak of loaves still in the bowl, with confidence and with respect for the fact that heat and time will have their say. Sometimes he wondered whether his gift, which had always been a door, might also be a knife. Music changes rooms. Could it change a life too much? He asked the question the way one tests a floorboard with a heel. She answered without being asked. "Play," she said. "Not to fix anything. To show where we are, he did, and the music did not command. It pointed. A map with here circled in bright ink, on the day the tragedy would choose. None of this mattered, and all of it did. The smoke of the wedding torch had long since been scrubbed by weather from the memory of anyone who wasn't looking for reasons. The sky was one of those spring skies that promise too much and then makes good on it. Eurydice lifted the basket, checked the knife, tucked the ribbon behind her ear, because it had come loose from the crown on the nail and seemed to want air. He retied a string that had behaved perfectly for months and had chosen mischief. They kissed as people kiss before ordinary errands, not like last times, which is the sharpest cruelty of last times. They never announce themselves. She went toward the meadow. He stayed to work a stubborn passage. The dog, diplomatic, lay down in the doorway and refused to pick a side. The world had already grown its snake, but that is the next hour's business. For now, remember the whole of what came before. The seasons, like pages, turned without tearing. The small repairs that keep a house from becoming a story about neglect. The 1,000 courtesies that keep love from exhausting itself. The way a village can be its best self when 2 of its people are brave enough to be gentle. If the ending must be the ending, let the beginning be remembered in full measure. He set the lyre in his lap and found the phrase he had been chasing all week. It sounded like dew that had learned to be light. He thought, "I will play this for her when the cypress shadow reaches the knee of the slope. She will like the part where the note holds longer than seems decent, and then resolves as if it never meant to scare you." He laughed to himself. The room approved. Somewhere outside, bees rehearsed. Somewhere further, a ribbon learned the wind. And the hour, generous and unsuspecting, walked forward into itself. The meadow that day looked harmless, even kind. Sunlight fell without edge, laying its gold across the grasses. The air smelled of mint and clover, and bees, heavy with pollen, swung from stem to stem, as if drunk on their own labor. Eurydice walked lightly, her basket balanced against her hip, the ribbon in her hair fluttering like a soft flame. She was humming, not a full song, only fragments of phrases Orpheus had been working the night before. The notes were crooked, unfinished, but they carried his presence, as if he walked invisibly beside her. She bent to cut a stalk of fennel, tested its strength with a practiced hand, and moved on. At the meadow's far edge, a shadow kept pace with her. Some said it was Aristaeus, son of Apollo and the huntress Cyrene, a shepherd who watched too closely, his desires sharpened by loneliness. Others whispered it was simply fate itself, prowling in borrowed shape, for tragedy needs no human accomplice. Whichever it was, Eurydice felt it. The shiver across her shoulders, the slight quickening of her steps. She looked back once, saw nothing but a ripple in the tall grasses. She told herself it was the wind. Then her foot pressed into a patch of clover. Beneath the green, coiled and silent, lay the snake. Its body had been warmed by hours of sun. Its patience was older than memory. When her heel brushed too close, it struck, swift as thought. The bite was small, almost delicate, 2 dark pinpricks against the pale skin of her ankle. But the venom spread with merciless clarity. Eurydice gasped, the basket tipping from her hand, herbs scattering like offerings no priest had asked for. She staggered, reached once for balance, and fell to her knees. The earth met her gently, but it could not hold her steady. The shadow, whether man or fate, vanished. The meadow, so bright a moment before, did not change, yet everything within it seemed suddenly cruel for its indifference. Birds still flew, bees still hummed, the river still whispered. Only Eurydice's breath grew shallow, her hands clawing faintly at the grass as if it might give her back her life. Her voice, when it came, was only one word. Orpheus. Not shouted, not even strong, only a thread of sound, woven of disbelief and longing. He heard it. Orpheus had been sitting beneath the fig tree they had planted together, testing the new phrase he wanted to play for her. The sound of her cry broke into him like a snapped string. The lyre slid from his lap as he leapt to his feet, heart hammering with a dread he did not yet name. He ran, his sandals slapping earth, his breath tearing at his chest. He found her in the meadow. She lay among the flowers, her hair tangled with mint and clover, her eyes wide and already losing their light. He fell beside her, gathered her in his arms, pressed his hands against the wound, as if pressure could command time to turn back. "Stay," he begged, though his voice broke. "Stay, love. The morning is not over. The house waits. The fig waits. I wait." "Stay," her fingers fluttered once against his cheek, like a moth brushing against glass. She tried to smile, and in that effort was more love than in a lifetime of words. Then her breath faltered. A last exhale, soft as silk slipping from the hand. Her body slackened. The meadow claimed its silence. Orpheus rocked her in his arms, his cries tearing against the sky. Villagers, hearing him, came running. They saw him cradling her, saw the herbs scattered, saw the snake sliding back into shadow, and they knew. With gentle hands, they lifted her, weaving a bier from branches, their faces heavy with pity. Orpheus followed, his steps dragging, his lyre hanging useless from his side. At home, the garlands from their wedding still hung on the wall. The crowns of grass and ribbon mocked with their innocence. The fig sapling leaned against the doorway, its roots unplanted, its promise unfulfilled. The bed they had shared the night before now looked cavernous, wide with absence. Orpheus wept until his body had no more tears to give. His voice, raw and trembling, turned to music because words could no longer hold his grief. He played, not for joy, not even for beauty, but because the world must hear the weight of what it had taken. The notes poured out broken and wild, sorrow shaped into sound. The animals gathered again, not curious, but mournful. Deer stood with heads bowed. Birds fell silent. Even rivers slowed, their waters heavy with sympathy. Trees bent their branches low, as if listening with sorrow. The air itself thickened, holding his grief. The gods heard too. Apollo lowered his shining head. Artemis stilled her hunt. Even Dionysus paused, his laughter fading. Yet none came to undo what had been done. For death, once written, does not yield easily. But Orpheus, who was mortal, was also capable of the impossible. He refused to accept what fate had written. If Eurydice had descended to the underworld, then he would descend as well. He would go where living feet had no right to tread. He would stand before Hades and Persephone, rulers of the dead. and he would not return without her. Thus, grief hardened into resolve. With his lyre in hand, Orpheus set his face toward the dark places of the earth, the places where shadows grew thick, where rivers ran black, where the mouth of the underworld yawned wide. He walked alone, and yet not alone, for every step carried the weight of love that refused to die. Night had fallen thick over Thrace, and the stars, sharp as pins, looked down with an indifference that made Orpheus's grief sharper still. He had buried his tears, but the emptiness inside him had become a fire, steady and merciless. His decision had ripened. If the gods would not give Eurydice back, then he would go to them and demand her. He set out alone. No companions, no torches, no food for the road. Only his lyre slung across his back and the resolve in his chest. The hills he knew so well looked different now. Shadows leaned closer, listening to him. Trees whispered like mourners. Wolves howled from ridges, but their voices softened when they caught his scent, as if they recognized the grief in him and let him pass. For days he walked. He crossed rivers that hissed with winter melt, his feet numb and blistered. He passed through villages where mothers hushed their children at the sight of him, awed and unsettled by the hollow light in his eyes. Farmers offered him bread, but he shook his head. He could not taste food. He drank only from streams and rested little, his sleep broken by dreams in which Eurydice called to him, her voice fading each time he tried to answer. At last, he came to a place where earth split open in a vast wound, a cavern, black and endless, where the air smelled of iron and damp stone. The locals avoided it, calling it a cursed place, the threshold of the underworld. To Orpheus, it was not curse, but promise. This was the door he sought. He stood at the mouth, trembling. A mortal entering Hades was an offense against nature, a challenge to the oldest laws. Yet love gave him courage sharper than fear. He touched his lyre. One note trembled out, clear and fragile, and the darkness seemed to recoil slightly, as though acknowledging him. Taking a breath, he stepped inside. The descent was steep and winding. The air thickened with each step, cold and heavy, pressing against his chest. The further he went, the more sound changed. His footsteps echoed strangely, and faint murmurs rose from the stone around him. These were no earthly noises, but whispers of the dead, fragments of forgotten names, sighs of lives once lived. Orpheus played his lyre softly as he walked. The notes spread like lanterns, faint circles of light in the endless dark. The whispers quieted, soothed by his song, as if the shades themselves leaned in to listen. Their pain eased for a moment by the music. Deeper still he went, until the passage opened into a vast plain of shadows. Here the air was thick with sorrow, and the ground was scattered with pale forms, souls wandering aimlessly, their eyes vacant, their steps slow. They drifted like autumn leaves, caught in a windless space. Some lifted their faces when Orpheus passed, drawn to the living warmth in him. He played, and their eyes glistened faintly with what might have been memory. A child's laughter, the scent of bread, the curve of a lover's hand. They reached toward him, but did not touch. For the living and the dead are bound by different laws. He pressed onward, heart pounding, until a growl rumbled through the air. The shadows shivered back, and from the darkness stepped the guardian of the underworld, Cerberus, the great hound with 3 heads and eyes like burning coals. His teeth gleamed white, each longer than a man's finger, his breath hot and foul with the scent of death. Chains rattled around his neck, yet no chain truly bound him. He was the will of Hades, unyielding. Cerberus blocked the path, each head snarling, each eye fixed on Orpheus. The ground shook with his growl. Any mortal would have fled. But Orpheus did not raise a weapon. He raised his lyre. He plucked a string, then another, weaving a melody not of war, but of rest. He played of cool shade on summer afternoons, of hands stroking a pup's fur, of hearth fires crackling softly. The sound poured like balm over the air. One of Cerberus's heads tilted, uncertain. Another yawned, teeth glistening, but no longer with hunger. The third lowered slowly to the ground, ears twitching. The growl faded to a sigh. With a final chord, Orpheus lulled the beast into slumber. The guardian of the dead lay stretched across the stones, dreaming like a child. Orpheus stepped past, his heart hammering with awe. His music had carried him further than mortal strength ever could. Beyond Cerberus lay a river, wide and black, its surface gleaming like oil. It was the Styx, the river of oaths, whose waters bound even the gods. No mortal could swim it. Its currents were not of water, but of memory and fate. Upon its shore waited the ferryman, Charon, cloaked in shadows, his face gaunt, his eyes empty hollows. His boat, a crooked thing of wood and bone, bobbed gently against the bank. No living soul crosses. Charon rasped, his voice like reeds rattling in a dry wind. His skeletal hand stretched out, waiting for payment. Orpheus said nothing. Instead, he lifted his lyre and played. The song rose low and steady, like dawn breaking over still water. It spoke of long journeys, of burdens carried without complaint, of promises kept through storms and silence. It carried no demand, only truth. The ferryman's hollow eyes flickered. For the first time in ages, his bony hand trembled. He lowered his oar, the boat drifting forward. Without another word, he beckoned Orpheus to step aboard. The boat moved across the Styx, its black waters licking at the hull as if yearning to drag it under. The air was heavy, pressing against Orpheus's chest. But he played still, and the river itself grew calmer, carrying them safely to the far shore. There, the plain stretched wider, filled with countless souls wandering in silence. Orpheus passed among them, playing softly, and they gathered near, their eyes lighting faintly. They could not follow far, but his music lingered with them, a reminder of what they had once been. Finally, the ground grew steeper, and before him loomed vast gates, black as obsidian and veined with fire that glowed like dying embers. Beyond them waited the thrones of Hades and Persephone, rulers of the dead. Orpheus tightened his grip on his lyre. He had passed beasts, rivers, and shadows. Now came the greatest trial, not of strength, but of love and courage. With steady steps, he approached the gates. The gates of the underworld loomed tall before him, carved of black stone veined with fire that pulsed like the slow heartbeat of the earth. They were not built to open for the living. Their hinges creaked with the memory of countless dead, and the very air around them seemed to resist, thick with the weight of laws older than Olympus. But when Orpheus lifted his lyre, the gates did not resist. He struck a single note, pure and trembling, and the sound spread through the iron like light through water. Slowly, with a groan that echoed across the plain, the doors parted, as though the kingdom of death itself was curious to hear the man who dared enter. He stepped inside. The great hall of Hades stretched vast and endless, hewn from stone blacker than night, its ceiling vanishing into shadow. Columns rose like petrified trees, their surfaces glimmering faintly with threads of fire. At the far end stood the twin thrones of the rulers of the dead. Hades sat rigid and immovable, his face stern as mountain granite, his eyes deep and dark as void. He wore a crown of iron, and in his hand rested a scepter tipped with obsidian. No warmth clung to him. He was inevitability made flesh. Beside him sat Persephone, pale and luminous, her beauty softened by sorrow. Though her crown was woven of shadow, her gaze held traces of spring. An echo of meadows and blossoms stolen from her by her husband's dark dominion. She leaned forward, curious, her fingers poised lightly on the arm of her throne. Around them clustered the Furies, eyes burning like coals, their serpentine hair writhing, their whips coiled and hissing. The shades of the dead filled the chamber, pale and silent, their murmurs a low tide of despair. All turned to face the lone figure who dared stand among them, Orpheus, mortal and fragile, with only a lyre in his hands. Hades' voice rolled out, not loud yet vast, as if spoken by the stone itself. Why does a living soul trespass in the kingdom of the dead? Orpheus bowed his head, but he did not kneel. His plea was not born of servitude, but of devotion. He tried to speak, but words trembled and faltered. And so he turned to the only language that had never failed him. He raised his lyre. The first notes rose soft as mist, tentative as dawn peeking over Thracian hills. Then stronger, fuller, until the hall itself seemed to pulse with the sound. Orpheus sang. He sang of Eurydice, of the meadow where she walked with herbs in her hand, of her voice, gentle as water over stones, of the way she smiled without vanity, as though she had invented patience. He sang of their wedding day, garlands bright with ivy, bread warm from the oven, laughter soft as firelight. He sang of the torch that smoked darkly, of the omen ignored, of love that asked only to endure. The music deepened, sorrow shaping every chord. He sang of the snake, of venom burning swift as betrayal, of the basket spilling herbs like a sacrifice no god had asked for. He sang of her eyes, wide with disbelief, her lips forming his name as her last word. He sang of his arms, empty, his bed cold, the fig sapling still unplanted by their door. The sound filled every corner of the hall. Persephone pressed her hand to her breast, her pale eyes glistening. The shades wept without knowing why. Even the Furies, who thrived on vengeance, lowered their torches and stilled their whips. Still Orpheus played, his voice climbing higher, trembling with devotion stronger than despair. He sang not only of loss, but of love unbroken by death. "Grant her to me," his music said. "Not because I command it, not because I deserve it, but because love such as this should not be silenced. If her time must come, let it come later. If all men must die, let me at least walk a few more years with her at my side. Let me keep my vow silence followed. Silence so heavy it seemed even the stone columns listened." Persephone turned to Hades. Her voice, when it came, was soft as the first sprout-piercing soil in spring. "Great Lord, have mercy. His song has stirred even me, who has sat so long in shadow. Love such as this deserves not to be mocked." Hades' gaze remained fixed on Orpheus. The god of death was not easily moved. Yet in his dark eyes flickered a spark, whether of pity or respect, none could tell. For a long moment, the hall held its breath. Then he spoke. You may have her." The words rippled across the chamber like thunder. Hope flared in Orpheus's chest. But Hades' voice was not finished. "Yet the laws of death cannot be broken without cost. She will follow you back to the world of the living. But there is one condition. You must not look back. Not once. Not until you have both stepped into the light. If you falter, if doubt overcomes you, she will return to me forever." The silence between those faint sounds grew long, too long. Doubt, sly as a snake, slid into his mind. What if she is not there at all? What if Hades mocked me, sending only an echo? What if the shadows stole her again, and I walk alone with only the memory? He clenched his jaw. "Trust," he told himself. "Trust is the bridge between the living and the gods. Trust is love in silence." So he walked on. The climb was long, cruel in its slowness. The cavern twisted, sometimes opening into vast chambers where shadows huddled like prisoners, sometimes narrowing to choking tunnels where even his shoulders scraped stone. Each turn, each step, stretched the thread of his will thinner. Once, the music of his lyre tempted him. His fingers itched to play, to fill the silence with sound that might reassure him. But he dared not. What if the act of turning the lyre even slightly broke the law? What if Hades' condition was so strict that even the tilt of his head might count as betrayal? He dared not risk it. The lyre remained silent at his side. The air began to change. Faint currents brushed his skin, carrying scents of soil, moss, even grass. The weight of darkness lifted slightly. Ahead, a thread of gold shimmered, the promise of daylight. His heart surged, just a little more, only a few dozen steps. But the silence behind him deepened. No footfall, no breath. He froze. Panic knifed through him. Why is she so quiet? Did she stumble? Has she been left behind? His mind, starved of reassurance, began to invent horrors. Perhaps she had been no more than a shade, an illusion conjured to test him. Perhaps she had fallen back into the Styx, dragged down by jealous waters. Perhaps she had never followed at all. He whispered her name, too soft to carry. But the cavern seemed to mock him with only the echo of his own voice. The light grew stronger ahead. He could see the mouth of the cave now, a jagged cut in the stone where daylight streamed like molten gold. He stepped into its glow, and for a heartbeat, the warmth of the sun kissed his face. He should have rejoiced. He should have trusted, but he could not bear it. The silence behind him was a wound too sharp. He turned, and there she was, Eurydice, pale and radiant, her form fragile as mist, yet more beautiful than he remembered. Her eyes locked on his, filled with longing, filled with love. She reached out her hand, fingers trembling with the effort of bridging the last inches between them. For that heartbeat, joy broke through his fear. He saw her. She was real. She was his. But already the shadows were clutching at her. Her body shivered, wavered, dissolved. Her lips parted as if to speak, to say his name one last time, but no sound came. Her hand stretched toward him, closer, closer, and then gone. Mist unraveled, drawn backward into the cavern, swallowed by darkness. The echo of her presence collapsed like a song cut short. No! Orpheus's cry tore from his chest, raw and ragged. He lunged forward, arms outstretched, but he grasped only empty air. His fingers clawed at the light, useless. The last trace of her, the look in her eyes, flickered and vanished. She was gone. Forever. He staggered, fell to his knees at the threshold, the sunlight cruel on his back, the cavern yawning before him like the mouth of a laughing god. His body shook with sobs, but no sound could match the emptiness in him. The law had spoken. He had broken faith. Eurydice was lost to him a second time, more cruelly than the first. For now he had seen her, touched her presence, and lost her not to fate, but to his own weakness. The weight of the words pressed like stone. Orpheus's heart wavered. To walk the long road in silence, never glancing, never reaching back, never confirming with his eyes the presence his soul demanded. Could he do it? And yet, he thought of her smile, her voice, her touch. He bowed his head. I accept. Persephone raised her hand. From the shadows, Eurydice appeared. She was pale, her form translucent as morning mist, her eyes dark with longing. She reached for him, her fingers trembling, though some unseen barrier kept her apart. For a heartbeat, Orpheus forgot to breathe. She was there, fragile, changed, but hers. He turned to the path leading upward. His heart thundered with both hope and dread. Behind him, her footsteps stirred faintly, lighter than air. Together, they began the ascent. The path upward stretched before Orpheus, like a promise and a threat. The cavern wound steep and narrow, its walls damp with tears the earth had been shedding since the first man died. The air was heavy, but lighter than the stillness of Hades' hall. And behind him, behind him, came the sound he had longed for with every breath since Eurydice had been taken. The faintest whisper of her footsteps. They were soft, almost nothing, lighter than a feather falling. But they were there. Orpheus's heart clenched. She was following. The gods had kept their word. The impossible had been granted. But he could not look. Every muscle in his body ached with the command, "Do not turn." His hands shook with the weight of the lyre he carried. His throat felt tight, as though even breath might betray him. His ears strained for her, greedy for each step. Yet the cavern seemed determined to confuse him, echoes rebounding, shadows whispering. Sometimes he thought her footsteps drew nearer. Sometimes they seemed to fade, as though she lagged behind. He knelt there for a long time, the lyre heavy in his lap, his eyes burning with salt that would not fall. The world outside glowed with brightness. Meadows, rivers, skies. But all seemed gray, drained of meaning. Birds sang, but their songs were knives. The scent of flowers was bitter. Every joy in the world was a cruelty. For what is sunlight when the one you love is swallowed by shadow? He rose at last, slow and broken. He left the cave, but he carried no triumph, no relief. Only the weight of a name he would never speak again without pain. Eurydice. And though the gods remained silent, though the world turned on, his song would never again be the same. Orpheus stepped into the daylight, but it no longer belonged to him. The sky stretched bright and boundless, the fields swayed with gold, the rivers sparkled with sunlight. But all of it was cruel. The colors had drained from his sight. To him, the world was ash. Where Eurydice should have been walking beside him, only silence followed. He wandered. Days bled into nights, nights dissolved into days. He carried his lyre always, pressed against his chest like an unhealed wound. But the songs he played now were no longer invitations to joy. They were laments. Long, slow, aching laments that wound themselves into the air and refused to leave. He played by rivers, and the waters slowed, heavy with sorrow, their ripples darkening. He played in forests, and the trees bent their branches low, shedding leaves out of season as if in mourning. Animals came still, but no longer with bright eyes and eager ears. They came quietly, heads bowed, their bodies heavy with the sadness his music stirred. Birds circled but did not sing. Deer stood motionless as statues, as if carved by grief. Even stones seemed to shiver, cracked open by his songs. Villagers whispered of him. They said Orpheus was no longer a man, but a shade wandering the earth. Some said his music was dangerous, too full of sorrow, that it hollowed out those who listened too long. Others pitied him, leaving food at the edge of his path, which he rarely touched. Women who admired his beauty, his devotion, and the legend of his descent into Hades came to him, offering love, offering arms, offering the comfort of companionship. He refused them all. "I have one bride," he said softly, his eyes distant. "She waits where I cannot go. My vow is not broken by death," and so he became a solitary figure, moving through the land like a dark hymn. He turned from the feasts of Dionysus, the wild god of wine and frenzy. He shunned the revels, the madness, the ecstatic dances. He wanted no forgetting, no intoxication. His grief was clear, sharp as a blade, and he would not blunt it with drink or distraction. To him, memory was the only truth left. But such devotion was a challenge to some. The Bacchantes, women devoted to Dionysus, crowned with ivy and driven by frenzy, saw Orpheus's refusal as an insult. They lived a wild abandon, their nights filled with drums and laughter that cracked into screams, their hands stained with wine and blood. To them, his quiet mourning, his refusal of their god's joy, was defiance. His faithfulness to Eurydice was a rebuke to their ecstasies. Whispers grew among them. Orpheus thinks himself above us. Orpheus mocks the power of Dionysus. Orpheus's music chains the soul, while ours sets it free. Their envy sharpened into rage. One twilight, when the sky was bruised with purple and the hills wore long shadows, Orpheus sat beneath a tall beech tree. His lyre rested on his knee. His song that evening was softer than usual, almost a lullaby, a melody of rivers and stars, of Eurydice's voice calling his name across silence. The animals lay around him, eyes closed, lulled by his music. Even the wind seemed to hush, listening. But the Bacchantes came. They moved like a storm of ivy and fire, their hair wild, their eyes glittering with frenzy. They stamped the ground in rhythm to drums that seemed to beat from the earth itself. Their voices rose, chanting the name of Dionysus, shrill and furious. Torches flared in their hands, smoke coiling black against the dusk. They circled him. Orpheus did not stop playing. His music rose like a shield, not to strike, but to soften. For a moment, even their frenzy faltered. The torches shook, their chanting wavered. A few wept suddenly, overwhelmed by the tenderness in his song. They remembered children they had lost, loves abandoned, homes destroyed. But frenzy cannot tolerate peace. It feeds on itself, demands escalation. One Bacchante screamed, tearing her hair. Another hurled her thyrsus, the ivy-crowned staff, striking the ground at Orpheus's feet. The spell broke. The storm rose. They rushed him. Orpheus tried to play louder, pouring every last thread of his soul into the lyre. But the clash of their screams, the pounding of drums, the frenzy of their bodies drowned him out. Stones flew, striking his head, his shoulders. Hands clawed at him, tearing his cloak, his hair. He staggered but did not flee. He clung to the lyre, his voice breaking as he tried to sing Eurydice's name one last time. They fell upon him, wild and merciless. Sticks and stones tore his flesh. His lyre snapped, its strings shrieking as they broke. The sound like the cries of birds struck in mid-flight. His body collapsed, torn and bloodied. Yet even as life fled, his lips shaped one word: Eurydice. The Bacchantes, still shrieking, cast his severed head into the river Hebrus. The current caught it, carried it onward, and still, miraculously, his lips whispered her name as the waters bore him away. His lyre, shattered but unyielding, drifted beside him, glowing faintly with the memory of his music. The river carried them to the sea, and the sea to the island of Lesbos. There, the Muses, his mother Calliope among them, gathered what was left of him. They wept, not only for their son, but for music itself, which had lost its purest voice. With reverent hands they laid his remains to rest. They lifted the fragments of his lyre, kissed its broken wood, and carried it to Olympus. Zeus himself, moved by their grief, took the instrument and placed it among the stars. And so the constellation Lyra was born, its small, steady pattern shining in the night sky, a reminder that music once softened even the heart of Hades. Sailors guided their voyages by it. Lovers traced it with their fingers against the dark. Shepherds pointed it out to their children. Few remembered Orpheus's name, but still they followed his light. His music, once played, could never be silenced. And in the meadows of the underworld, Eurydice waited. When at last Orpheus's shade descended, broken but free from pain, she met him not with reproach, but with love. She reached out her hand, and he took it. Together they walked among the fields of asphodel, no longer fearing parting, for death could not divide them again. The death of Orpheus did not end his song. If anything, it freed it. His music, too great for one mortal body to contain, poured into the world and remained, echoing across centuries. His story became not just the tale of a man and his lost bride, but a mirror in which each age, each artist, each dreamer saw its own reflection. In Rome, poets first gave the myth permanence. Virgil wove it into his Georgics, a poem meant to teach of farming and labor. Yet he could not resist setting Orpheus and Eurydice like a dark jewel in its crown. To Roman readers, hardened by empire and war, the story was a revelation. Here was proof that music could stand against the laws of gods, and that love was not diminished by death, only made more desperate. Then came Ovid, the restless genius who gathered all the world's myths into his metamorphoses. To Ovid, Orpheus was not simply a grieving husband. He was the poet himself, the artist who cannot help but look back, forever reaching into memory for what the present has already lost. Eurydice, in Ovid's telling, becomes the eternal absence around which every poem coils, the shadow that makes the song necessary. Through his verses, the myth became more than personal tragedy. It became the definition of art. Painters of the Renaissance gave Orpheus color and shape. They set him in luminous landscapes, surrounded by animals lulled into peace, or placed him at the brink of the cave, Eurydice's hand slipping from his fingers as light and shadow tore them apart. In these canvases, grief was painted in gold and ochre, every brushstroke a hymn to longing. Some artists chose the moment of his triumph, the hall of Hades weeping at his song. Others chose the moment of his failure, his eyes turning, her body dissolving like mist. Both were true, for in Orpheus, victory and defeat were the same note, heard differently by gods and men. The Baroque age, with its taste for grandeur, found in Orpheus the perfect subject for its newest invention: opera. Claudio Monteverdi's L'Orfeo, one of the very first operas ever written, told his story in music that soared and wept, its voices rising like the spirits of the dead themselves. Audiences sat in awe, hearing Orpheus not as myth but as flesh and voice. Centuries later, Christoph Gluck would refine the tale in Orfeo and Eurydice, a work of haunting beauty that gave Eurydice more voice than she had ever been granted before. In these operas, the myth found its truest form, a story about music, told through music, echoing back upon itself like a hall of mirrors. Nor did it stop there. In the Romantic age, poets and painters returned to him again. To them, Orpheus was the symbol of the artist misunderstood, the dreamer destroyed by a world too brutal to bear the delicacy of beauty. His backward glance became the very emblem of human frailty. Our inability to trust, our desperate need to see, to confirm, to touch, even when faith would save us. Eurydice became the muse forever slipping away, the ideal love always lost at the very moment it is found. Even in the 20th century, Orpheus still sang. Jean Cocteau reimagined his descent not into caverns, but into mirrors, suggesting that the true underworld is the realm of our own reflections, our own obsessions with the past. Poets like Rainer Maria Rilke heard in him the eternal voice of the artist, opening the doors of the dead, not with keys, but with song, forever stretching toward the unreachable. Philosophers, too, claim the myth. Some said it proves that art is always about looking back, that creation is a resurrection attempt, doomed to fail, but beautiful in its failure. Others saw in it a parable of trust, that love demands faith in the unseen, and that doubt, even born of love, can undo us. And still others said the story is not about weakness at all, but about humanity. Only gods can walk without looking back, because gods never lose. Mortals bound by fragility must look, and in that glance lies everything that makes us human. Above, in the night sky, Orpheus's lyre still shines. The constellation Lyra, with its bright star Vega, guides sailors, shepherds, and wanderers. Few remember the myth as they follow its light, yet they walk under his music nonetheless. His song has become woven into the fabric of the cosmos, a reminder that beauty, once created, cannot be destroyed, only transformed. And so, every time a violin weeps in a concert hall, every time a poet whispers a name into the dark, every time a lover keeps faith with someone who's gone, Orpheus lives again. His backward glance becomes ours. Eurydice's fading step becomes the echo of all we have loved and lost. Their myth is no longer theirs alone. It is ours, the song each of us carries, whether we choose to play it or not. And so the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice closes, not with triumph, but with a silence that still sings. Their love could not conquer death, yet it became something perhaps greater, a song that has never ceased to echo. From the meadows of Thrace to the halls of Hades, from Roman poetry to Renaissance paintings, from opera stages to the quiet night sky where lyra still glimmers, Orpheus's music continues, and Eurydice's name is still whispered. Perhaps the true gift of their story is not the ending, but the remembering. Love cannot always win, but it can endure, shaping every song, every canvas, every word we pass to each other. And in that endurance, Orpheus and Eurydice are never truly gone. As you look up tonight, maybe you will find lyre shining above you, steady and small among the constellations. If you do, remember this. Every backward glance, every fragile hope, every word spoken into silence, we all share them. This myth belongs not just to the ancient world, but to us, here and now. And I would love to know. What do you think? Was Orpheus's backward glance a failure, or was it the purest proof of love? That even on the threshold of life, he could not resist seeing her face one more time. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd be honored to read them. If this story touched you tonight, if you felt the echo of Orpheus's music or the longing of Eurydice, please remember to like this video and subscribe, so you can join me again for the next journey into the timeless myths and legends that shape us all. Until then, may your nights be gentle, your dreams steady, and may you always find music even in silence.